The very fiber of American food is rooted in indentured servitude, immigrant influence.
Nashville hot fried chicken. Perfect example. In Tennessee, Prince's was the original hot fried chicken, owned by a Black man, black family. You can now count at least 6 to 10 hot chicken restaurants that are white owned.
Welcome to Voices of Esalen. I'm Sam Stern. Today our episode features a conversation between my colleague Esree Peoples and Chef Elle Simone. During their conversation, Chef Elle and Esree trace the relationship between cuisine and American culture. They reflect upon the role of food and flavor in the shaping of our nation and peek into what the future of culinary experience could be like within the context of a truly free and inclusive country. Chef Elle Simone is a well-known American chef, culinary producer, test cook, and food stylist. In 2013, after realizing that women and people of color were underrepresented amongst chefs, she founded SheChef, a mentoring and networking organization for women of color in the culinary field. She can be seen on PBS on America's Test Kitchen and is the first African-American woman to appear as a regular host on that show. Chef Elle is also a survivor of ovarian cancer and shows up as an activist and representative in that space. Esree Peoples is Associate Director of Diversity and Inclusion Education at Tufts University. She has over 25 years of experience serving in leadership roles that revolve around social justice in the arts, education, political, and nonprofit sectors. She advises organizations on how to best create internal conditions that allow equity, diversity, inclusion, and justice to flourish. Her opinions and writings have been featured in the Washington Post, Oakland Post, BlogHer, and YFS Magazine. Esree is currently rooted in motherhood, love, and community in Somerville, Massachusetts, and we are so happy to have her as a contributor to this show.
All right, so I am Esree Peoples. I have Chef Elle Simone with me to step into a brief conversation today. Just a longtime friend and colleague, very much admire how Chef Elle Simone just kind of shows up in the world and her thoughts and her creativity and her words and insights with this project. So I'm going to just dive in. I'm going to have you introduce yourself. I think it's more authentic for folks to just introduce themselves than the person introducing you. So if you could just tell us how you are currently showing up in the world, how you're contributing or investing in the quality of just our collective human experience. And then what are perhaps your identities and values that you're bringing into the space, into our conversation today, that's going to ground us in our conversation.
Sure. So my name is Elle Simone Scott. I'm a native Detroiter. I currently live in the greater Boston/New England area. I am by trade a culinarian, a food stylist, which is an extension of making food appealing for consumers. And I work in culinary media, which is multidisciplinary, right? It's magazine, it's TV, it's podcasts. At some point, it had been radio. And, those are just small boxes of one larger box of culinary media that is ever changing and evolving as new generations come along. It looks different. I've been doing this work for almost 15 years, and I feel like it's a large part of who I am and what I do, but sometimes I feel in the grand scheme of what life requires, it's a small part of what I want to do. So I show up in spaces of ovarian cancer advocacy. I show up in spaces of all of the isms that fall under any profession, especially culinary, racism, classism, sexism. I show up in advocacy for marginalized people by way of my organization called SheChef Incorporated, which specifically focuses on the advocacy, growth, and development of women of color in food spaces, even more specifically Black women in food spaces. I also show up in the world as a matriarch for my family, and also I think just an overall community service person. I was raised having to do a lot of community service as a child. You know, it was not optional.
Mm-hmm.
When my friends were having paid summer jobs, I had to volunteer. So, that I have a service gene, as I like to refer to it, so like anywhere where there's service needed that I have the capacity to fulfill, I do. And so I think, those are my primary spaces. Of course, I'm a woman, I'm a Black woman, I'm queer, so I'm always, always just naturally by waking up every day, showing up in those spaces. I in the past have been far more active in the LGBTQIA plus community, but ovarian cancer is kind of like my current banner. So that takes up a good amount of my time. And I'm a daughter, a partner, and aspiring to be other things in life. So I show up as a person who's always searching for pieces of my identity in the world, putting the puzzle pieces together to fulfill my destiny of completing the puzzle one day so that I can transition peacefully to the next realm.
Right, right. That's beautiful. And that I had a smile on my face when you're talking about community service and that just being a gene. I remember growing up, back in the day, I don't know if all high schools were like this, but I remember in high school, it was a requisite to put in community service. Like it was a part of, like I had to put in a certain amount of hours in order to graduate, right?
Yes.
So while people were holding down jobs at the mall, getting discounts on clothes, I was painting fences at a library,
Yeah, good old Habitat for Humanity, even, doing
right.
all of those things.
All of those things and all of the pieces that you lifted up, how you show up in the world. And I also smile when you offer that you are a matriarch for your family. And it's absolutely fascinating to me that when you traditionally think of a matriarch, I think of like an older person. I think of, grandmothers and great aunts or great grandmothers. And it's just indicative of like the shifting of culture and time that, many like for myself, I'm a Gen Xer, right? So many Gen Xers, early mid 40s, even late, like are stepping into these very meaningful, very important roles, particularly within the Black community. Like the role of a matriarch is profound, and it seems like it, people stepping into those roles are a bit younger than they have traditionally been. All of the things and the ways in which you're showing up ultimately is like seems to be grounded in relationship with yourself, right? And how that translates into the breadth and depth of relationships with others around you and your community. So that's fascinating as well. Given your background, what are your thoughts on both the historical and modern role that food has had in our collective human experience? And in your opinion, what role has it had within particularly movements around justice and liberation?
That's a very interesting question that I don't get asked often, but I think is extremely important. And to be honest with you, I am just scratching the surface on the deep dive that is probably the real answer to that question. But the very fiber of American food is rooted in indentured servitude, immigrant influence. While it seems, probably even as I'm saying it, and somebody might be listening to this and think like, well, yeah, I mean, they call America the melting pot, right. And it's like, that might be true, but like whether people actually accept this melting pot from a culinary perspective is actually very different, right? Tony Martin wrote a book called The Jemima Code. And the Jemima Code basically explored cookbooks of the early 19th century in America and their authors and their credits, right? Like who actually wrote this book, what are the source of these recipes, right? Because as we know, there's a certain time in history when there would have been no white people cooking food in their own kitchens, right? And not only is a part of that history a part of the horrific historical act of slavery, but it also actually carried over until mid and almost late 19th century, right? Like 1950,
is
You still
probably,
have folks that you still have the help and people coming in cooking for you.
Yeah, it's probably the most recent documented, indentured servitude related to food specifically, right? That remained, right? Like that was like the last piece. Someone to care for the children, someone to cook the food, right? So these recipes that these housewives were sharing at their dinner parties and, inviting friends over for were recipes that were not created by them or cooked by them. They were cooked by the help. Right. But these women also, these same white women who did not produce one single recipe also wrote cookbooks using the recipes that they were not saying inspired by. I'm using the word inspired by the recipes that the help cooked for them and their families and their friends as they grew older. Right. So there's a very distorted past, as with most things in the US, as it relates to food originality, food, credit for recipes and service, right? And so that is kind of the beginning of the culinary history, right, of this world. And then also immigrants who come over to this country. We're talking about Africans who were enslaved, who brought seeds over in their hair. It can get deep and wide really, really fast when we talk about the fabric of food in this country. Yes. Yep. And so,
all of the things,
all the things, right? It gets really, really deep, all the things. And, we want to say, we're having huge conversations right now about like cultural appropriation versus appreciation in the culinary industry, right? Like we're talking about people considering cultural foods as fast food, right? Like for forever, we call Chinese food carry out, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And not because we literally carry it out, but it is a language used to diminish the relevancy and the value, right? Even erasure of culture and food, right? There's been lots of conversations going on about how do we take food out of this particular cultural aspect of treating it like it's not important.
Right. And that kind of arcs back to this notion of the melting pot, right? I was in a conversation. I attended a webinar a couple of days ago when we kind of peeled back the layers around melting pot. And while at first hearing of it, or originally it was meant to suggest that we're all in this together, all of us make up this wonderful juicy pot of whatever this melting,
right,
whatever it is, and it's great. But the flip side of that is if everything is melted into each other, there's no distinction and there's
it's diluted.
It's diluted. So in talking about like erasure, for example, the example with the Chinese food, to simply call it takeout in the melting pot framework, it, like you said, like it loses the value. You lose what the culture and the flavors and the spices and the time and the heat and the cooling down of making a dish. You lose all of that when you simply say carry out or simply dump it into a melting pot, right? It loses all. It severely compromises, right?
It severely compromises. I mean, even to take it a step further, that really it's Chinese American food that's considered takeout, and it diminishes the Chinese American experience in this country and, what they had to do to establish themselves, in this country and just apply that same principle to every culture, every culture, every single one. And, I think that people really don't realize, how impactful these same patriarchal capitalistic concepts roll right into the kitchen, even to the kitchen hierarchy system that is based on the French kitchen brigade, which is only men, right? It tips its toe in a lot of different ponds, know.
And within patriarchy, like the permission to absorb someone's creativity as your own, right? Because that still carries over. Like, I think about High on the Hog on Netflix, and just how like Southern cuisine and the Black community, how the evolution of Black American food, for example, right?
Yes, but you know what else that tends to dilute also the Black American experience in regions other than the South, right? Like, it's the focus because that's really where we like to think for Black Americans. I mean, we know that's where our history starts, but like,
right.
we don't think about the Black Americans in Kansas or the Midwest in
Or the
Michigan,
Midwest, right.
all of the influences that Black cooking, Black food, Chinese cooking, Chinese food, all these
Where it
cultures
permeates,
really, so it gets,
and who's benefiting, who, like the restaurants that we have, like it, even though it's in the South, but it could be in different regions, the Midwest, wherever you go, there are restaurants that aren't Black owned, but are offering up Black cuisine and making money off of it, right? So like in terms
perfect example, Nashville hot fried chicken, right? In Tennessee, Prince's was the original hot fried chicken, owned by a Black man, Black family. You can now count at least 6 to 10 hot chicken restaurants that are white owned.
Right.
Right.
Just a quick example.
KFC is doing it, right? That's just a quick example, right?
I'm going to move us forward, and I'd like to invite you briefly to think about fast forwarding to America's future, right? So maybe 30 years out is 2052. Our national context is a future where we're no longer existing within supremacist frameworks, whether that's racial supremacy, white supremacy, patriarchy, economic supremacy, capitalism. We're no longer in that framework, and we're no longer actively resisting supremacist mindset, right? My question is like, what does that 2052 America look like and feel like for you and your body? How do you see food presenting itself in that 2052 experience?
I think I see 2052 looking like a time where food will be presented with its historical context without question or explanation, right? Like enjoying jollof rice without having to talk about the history of rice and, like, just know, like, this is Nigerian jollof rice, this is Ghanaian jollof rice, like without explanation and without
persuasion.
Without having to, really get into why these foods are important, right? People really enjoying food because of the ultimate importance of having world cuisine and food knowledge, right? Like, I definitely see more women chefs at the helm of that. And I see people having pride in their cuisine being explored in an authentic way, that I think, and what is really comforting is that we are actually already moving in that direction. The needle has been lifted and reset, and people are feeling more affirmed in their identity as it relates to food. So publications, the New York Times, the Washington Post, all of these outlets that have like major food emphasis are excited about moving in that direction because the complexity of food is so welcomed and it's so exciting. And it just brings so much more real context to the cultural experience of being an American in general,
right.
And so I feel like 2052 is going to look like that, but like super shiny and more polished and, definitely more publications, books, podcasts, all those things. If they even still exist in 2052, right? I feel like these conversations will be led with, without that patriarchal scope, right? They'll be led just going right into like, let's explore this food, and that's gonna be an exciting time. I hope I'm here to see a little bit of it.
I hope so too. And what like, let's just explore this food. Let's just taste it and enjoy it together without any, like you're saying, when not having to explain, right?
Yes.
Or give a history, because when I was listening to you, I was thinking, man, when we do explain or give context, it's asking, in a sense, it might feel like us asking permission to be asking permission to taste this Nigerian jollof, right? Ghanaian jollof, like asking permission in a space that wouldn't necessarily grant us permission. And in the world that, you know, in the America that you're talking about in 2052 is kind of like being and enjoying food without asking permission, right? Because it all simply belongs, right?
Yes, yes, yes. I mean, and I hope that even amongst the varying cultures that even happens, right? I think that's what I hope the most, right? Because
Mhm.
we, even in the Black food community, right, we have these really interesting conversations about like, how do you make your grits, with sugar or with salt and pepper and butter, right?
Right.
Or, you know, and a perfect example is also the jollof rice. Like
Mm.
different regions make it different, you know, and amongst the like groups, we're having conversations about whose way is the right way. You know, like we have
Right.
in the Midwest, we have this thing, which I know you're aware of. We serve fried fish with spaghetti, right? Like
Right.
that's a very common combination. And there are people who look like the people who cook that way, who are, you know, who question the validity of it. Like, no, you don't do that. You're not supposed to do that, you know? So even amongst the cultural groups, not, you know, not
Within.
diminishing,
Mhm.
yeah, you know, like not
Mhm.
diminishing the very individual experience of being whatever you are in America. You know, like there should be
Yeah.
no conversation or competition
Or
anti,
right or wrong.
yes, right or wrong amongst like, you know, like Szechuan Cantonese food versus American Chinese food. These are all real life experiences. So I hope in 2052 that it looks like coexistence amongst the like tribes about the ways in which they have had this very real experience of being in this country, and how it all
Mhm.
really is interwoven and really supports one another. You know,
Right.
like there's no American Chinese food without Chinese food, right? Like the American
Right.
Chinese food shows the legacy, the survival, you know, the attempts to survive and the attempts to retain cultural aspects, but while becoming who we have to become to live in this country, right? Like
Right.
there, those, you can't have one without the other,
One
right?
without, right. If you unravel one of that thread, you again you compromise. It's not a tapestry
Yes.
that's whole, right?
Yep.
If you
Yep.
take out one piece of that thread or the color in the weave of it, it's no longer a whole fabric. Literally, there will be holes in it.
Yep.
You
Yep.
know,
There will be holes. Someone's story is not going to get told, and we can't have that, right? Like
right?
that's not, we can't.
That's just not a thing anymore. And
No.
not having, you know, a part of this, what I'm hearing too is in the pursuit of having all of the stories told, you actually have to reject or like you have to refuse the notion of binary, right? Like
Yes.
black,
Yes.
white, wrong, right, right.
Yep.
All of the either or, you know, and it has to be a more of an intentioned collective and both and all, right? Because
Yep.
without and all, you actually will eventually have nothing, right? If you're taking out pieces of the fabric and creating holes, eventually there is no tapestry, right?
There's no us. Yep. Yep.
Wow.
Yep.
We just had a sermon and we need to
Okay.
open the doors to the church. I guess my before we wrap up, you mentioned briefly that, you know, there are conversations already happening and the needle has really already been picked up and placed in a way that places us on a different trajectory towards what we, you know, this futuristic America and what food
Yes.
tastes like and looks like and is how it's talked about. I'm wondering from your vantage point if there are are there additional conversations we should be having, or are there like in the conversations, are there gaps that we might want to consider filling so that we have more of a robust conversation moving us forward?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, and you know, this probably could be a whole another conversation in and of itself, but
Mm.
you know, when we're talking about food and America and, you know, culture and ethnicities, you know, we're talking about, you know, socioeconomic issues that come to the forefront, such as like food insecurity, food accessibility, right? At America's Test Kitchen, where I work, this is not a plug, but one of the ways in which we approach creating recipes there is how accessible are the ingredients to the home cook, right? Like, we are trying to bridge this divide between how can we teach the home cook how to cook these wonderful recipes from these different regions of the world, but also teach them how to do so with ingredients that are accessible at their local market, right? So there's that piece. Like, how do you do that without diluting the authenticity of the recipe, right? This is the kind of the conversation we have about cultural appropriation versus appreciation when it comes to creating, executing recipes. So there's that piece. But then we talk about, does everyone in the country have access to the same basic ingredients, which kind of moves into the food insecurity, food desert conversation, right?
Socioeconomic conversation,
yes,
capitalism, right?
yes, yep. Like, what's accessible in what neighborhoods and why or why not, right? So like, that is the real, I think that's the beginning of the real food conversation in this country. Like, we could of course always approach it quickly and inevitably from the food culture perspective, but like, who can even cook healthy foods at all, right? Like, who even has an option to cook the way that they would like to cook, right? Like, I might have ideas about cooking a certain way. When I go visit some of my relatives in Detroit, I remember going home for Indigenous Persons Day, right? And not being able to just get like fresh ingredients in my aunt's neighborhood, and I think it was the first time I realized that I actually have, even though my relatives shop outside of their neighborhood for things that they need because they have access to do that. They have a car, they can get to, but like, if someone did not have all of the tools or the resources to do that, they're restricted to what's in their neighborhood, and what's in their neighborhood is extremely limited, right? Even maybe even towards what culturally they are accustomed to eating in
the first
in their family. Right. So like, the beginning conversation has to be like, who has access to foods and why not and how not, of just like, eating healthy, or eating to towards your culture or demographic. Like, can that even happen for everyone? And as long as the answer to that is no, the greater conversation in this country is about food access, food health, GMOs. It can go far and wide, as with many conversations, but like, just the average American having access to foods that are sustainable for life and living.
Right. Thinking about food as a resource, ingredients for food as a resource. And then, like you're saying, like, as you're pointing to, if the response to the question is like, no, then what do we need to do to give access to the resources, to the ingredients, to the cilantro, to the peppers, to the lettuce?
Right. Because really, food shouldn't even be considered a resource. Like, food is really, that's like a right.
That's a basic right, like water and education, right? So
yes, it's a basic it's like the basic fundamental need to live, breathe every day. Right. You have to feed your body, right? So like, why is that even something that we have to, be discussing or considering? Why is that an issue in a country that, that is allegedly built on certain standards? And, like, why are we having conversations about food access? Like, everyone deserves food. Everyone deserves health care. Everyone deserves education that doesn't spiral them in debt. Like, it's a basic right, need, we should have, right? And that doesn't happen in this country. And why?
Right. Why? And then in 2052, moving us, like, what are the conversations we need to have to reset us, right? To reset the notion, to move us out of these things being resources and all of these things being what's basic and what it is offered to all of us based off of like human dignity, right? Just off of that, right? So like,
just
changing that. that narrative. And a part of this, like the other branch of this is, I would imagine, in terms of conversations, how do we do all of what you just said, those in the conversation? And how do we, in terms of thinking about like becoming an ancestor and eventually at some, like transitioning to our seat among the ancestors, what's the work that we need to do in the here and now?
Yes.
With the younger generation, what do we need to pass on to them?
Yes.
So that when we transition, they have all of the things that they need to move their families forward and generations forward with regards to food and
yes.
health and wealth in their health, right?
Yes. I think that if we can, 2052 looks like real cultural appreciation as it relates to food, like a sincere positioning about the importance of cultural relevancy and preservation. I feel like if we're there in 2052, that means at some point before 2052 we will have embraced it as important, and people will look at the communities as a true representation of that and realize that in order for that to happen, everyone has to have equal access to what they need in terms of food, right? Like, I can't show you how important it is to me to be Mexican American in this country if I live in a neighborhood where I cannot even reproduce for you the very fabric, which is the food, right? That's the beginning of it, right? The very fabric of the food culture. I can't even reproduce that for you because I don't live where I have access. So I feel like there's a plug, there's an outlet, and there's a plug there, right? And if we can put those two together, then that will be the shift that makes 2052, as we've just discussed it, a reality.
Right? I think that is a great spot to end our conversation on. Like,
me too.
Thanks for listening to Voices of Esalen. Today's show is produced in conjunction with Shira Levine. Our theme music is by Nico Holloman. Next up, we got Louis Schwartzberg talking about his new film, the follow-up to Fantastic Fungi. It's called Gratitude Revealed. So until next time, be well.